Never assume anything about anyone. You just mentioned about the hidden disabilities. You cannot see who has a disability or not. And so never assume anything about anyone. Always ask the person. And by asking the person, you are then providing that space for them to say they actually have an adjustment.
Welcome to The Greener Way. I'm your host, Rose Mary Petrass, Senior Journalist at FS Sustainability. We are recording on Gadigal land. We pay our respects to traditional custodians of country and elders past, present and emerging. In Australia, more than 4 million Australians have a disability. That is around 18% of the population. And more than 90% of disabilities are invisible. Today, we hear from Corene Strauss, CEO of the Australian Network on Disability. Welcome to the podcast, Corene.
Thanks, Rose, and thanks for having me.
Let's start off by talking about the work of the Australian Disability Network. For those who haven't heard of it, what is it that you do there?
So Australian Disability Network is Australia's peak body to help build the confidence and capability of employers to welcome and include people with disability into the organisation, not just as employees, but also as customers. And we do that through a range of ways, namely building their capability, connecting them with each other as members, and also connecting them with people with disability, and then also checking them around benchmarking them around how they're going against other organisations, even globally, and also how they're going around their recruitment practices and giving them, a check around how inclusive they are in their recruitment practices.
So people with disabilities are employed at a rate 30% lower than the general population. Why are so many organisations so slow on engaging disability in their operations and culture?
Rose, that is such a good question. It's also such a pie-in-the-face moment when you say that, because do you know that those stats have not changed for over 20 years? And it's really hard to understand why. But when, we know that everybody is trying to do it. But I guess, let me say some of the key areas why we think this has not changed. And I think the first thing I would say, based on my own experience and also just talking to our members, the first thing is the lack of understanding and awareness. They don't have a comprehensive understanding on the rights of people with disability and how to and what to do. And so it's that fundamental thing. The other thing is the barriers, the attitudinal barriers that people have about people with disability. These are ingrained stereotypes and biases against people with disability. And these things lead to assumptions about people with disability that they're less capable or, low expectations. And so naturally we exclude people with disability by doing that. And the third thing is, and I can see the impact of this, is the lack of education and training. There's not enough of it in the organisations. And I think organisations should really look at least once a year or on a regular basis when they are doing their inductions with new employees, that they also learn and understand why and how to be more inclusive of people with disability. There's a range of other issues. For instance, probably another one that I hear from time to time, which I do laugh at because actually it's so unfounded, but this fear of risk and the cost, the view that there's a cost to employ people with disability. Actually, the people with disability know their disability and know their limitations, and so they're not going to do things that are out of their comfort zone, right? So the risk is not there. The second thing is that people say, the adjustments are going to cost a lot. Well, actually, the data actually says that most adjustments do not cost anything. And on average, those that do cost, on average, do not cost more than $1,000. And you're only looking at about 30% of those adjustments that need it. So 66% do not require do not require cost. 30% would require cost, and the average of that is about $1,000. So, there's a range of other reasons why, but those are the things that keep coming up. And the other thing I'd say too that I'm really noticing, and this is the voice of people with disability, is that we're not seeing enough representation of people with disability in the organization. So when you talk about shareholder organizations, you're talking about boards and you're talking about the C-suite. We're not seeing leaders with disability on there. Excluded, lack of understanding, lack of provision for adjustments, etc. So I think if we can see that in advertising and at board level, we'll also get to see a lot of improvement around that. And also, we are talking about ESG. And I think my point here is to say that there is not enough reporting on the inclusion of people with disability in the workplace. That in itself has its issues, but we should see more reporting. And I know in Europe, they have about 72% of companies report, and in the US, I think it's about 60%. But interestingly, the data is quite different on those two organizations. So I hope I haven't taken up too much of your time. It's a passion subject for me, but that is why I think we're not seeing the representation of people with disability.
Corene, those are some great statistics. And we're going to talk a little bit later about how organisations can implement best practice when it comes to disability inclusion. As you know, our listeners are majority in the finance industry. Why does inclusion matter for responsible or ethical investors?
Well, I'll say one thing, and that is that you are including the people that you represent in the community. So people with disability are investors themselves. Many of them are, in the workplace. They are purchasers of products and services. And so absolutely it matters. You need to represent the company in which you are actually benefiting from.
So, Corene, how does inclusion have a financial impact on business success?
There is a whole lot of data that was done by Accenture which talks about the fact that including people with disability really helps productivity. There was I can't remember the exact data, but if people are interested, Accenture did this report and they demonstrated that shareholder return was twice bigger than people who weren't inclusive as an organization. And culturally, if you are an inclusive organization, the data actually says that you are a much more productive organization. And there's a lot of data that also talks about the fact that the retention is better when you have people with disability in the workplace, and a range of other numbers, which I don't have on my fingertips right now. I wish I did. But yes, there is a lot that actually supports the fact that inclusive employment, but not just inclusive employment, inclusive services and products are beneficial to the organization's bottom line.
That's some really impressive data. Let's talk about how organizations can implement best practice. What should an organization do to get started if they're yet to have accessibility in their day-to-day operations and culture?
That's a good question. How to get started. So first thing I would say is that this is a journey. You cannot change things overnight because this is about mindset shift, and it's about making sure that the experience for a person with disability is as positive as the person who is being inclusive of a person with disability. So we have to do this together. This is a work in progress, but there's a number of things that you can do. For instance, the first thing is we would suggest you do is to conduct an accessibility audit. And so that's to look at your organization and say, well, how are we inclusive and accessible around our information communications technology? Is our website inclusive? Are our board papers inclusive? That means that can a blind person read the papers? I'll tell you what, you would be amazed how many shareholder reports and the PDF documents are completely inaccessible for people who are vision impaired. Are you presenting your shareholders meeting in such a way that a person who is neurodiverse or who has anxiety or who has hearing impairment or chronic illness, are your meetings, your shareholder meetings accessible? Can they access the building? So do this accessibility audit as the first thing, is to ask the question. The other thing is implement policies. So, Rose, it's really important that when somebody comes into the workplace who has a disability, that they have workplace adjustments that they can request, like, for instance, maybe flexible hours because they need, they they may need to have some chronic illness treatment or whatever. So make sure you've got policies in place so that it's not like they're jumping hoops. The policy is there. Can I please be near a bathroom because I have a colostomy bag or whatever it is? Those policies are in place and there's no arguing about it. So make sure you've got inclusive policies. And also, the other thing is to do that. I mentioned training previously. Training is so important. And so if an organization is training and educating its people, then that process is a lot more barrier free in terms of including people with disability as customers, not just as employees, but as customers as well. And, also most organizations, and if you're talking about the financial services sector, many of them are very large organizations and many of them actually employ people with disability. So if you haven't done it yet, one of the best things that you can do is to get people with disability together and form your disability employee network. And that group is a really great group to educate, to do storytelling, to share their experience and to demonstrate the why it matters and how you can be better at including people with disability. And I think probably another thing, and a lot of our members do this, and this is where you start to see things changing, is when you do your workplace disability inclusion action plan. You've now looked at your scenario and you've gone and you've spoken to people with disability in your organization and you've said, okay, we need to get better at this. Let's do a plan. And that plan should be the thing that shareholders see that the organization is actually delivering on its commitment to be an inclusive organization. So the ESG and the social of that is about inclusion. And so by doing your action plan and actually putting it in a public space will also demonstrate your commitment to change. There's a number of other reasons, and I'd be happy to go on, but I don't want to take up all the airspace. But those are some examples of things to do.
That's really helpful. And once organizations have implemented those plans, how can investors and the organizations themselves measure the effectiveness of those disability inclusion initiatives?
Well, that's a really good question because you want to see what an organization is doing. So earlier I said to you, build an action plan, right? That's a question you want to, as a shareholder, I'm now putting my shareholder hat on. I would be asking the organization, what disability action plan do you have? And what are your key pillars that you're working towards? How are you reporting it? What data are you collecting around people with disability? Now, can I just say that collecting data has its challenges because not every person with disability will want to share that they have a disability. Not every person with disability requires a workplace adjustment. People with disability are on a continuum. So today I'm fine, but by the time I'm 60, 1 in 3 people will have a disability. By the time I'm 70, 1 in 2 people will have a disability, which is why you need to think about your shareholders and how you are being accessible and inclusive for those people. But, you want to look at how you're collecting data, and collecting data for the HR system gives you a lower number. Collecting anonymous information, you'll find there's a better number around that. So there's 2 ways around how you do it. So people want to know why you're collecting the data and how you're going to use it. And unfortunately, a lot of people with disability don't want to give their information because they're scared they're going to be judged and they won't get promotion opportunities or, something will go wrong. So that's another reason why you don't always get the true data, which is why the anonymous feedback is often useful. And I think, how else to measure is to make sure that you've done access and inclusion audits as well, and what those results said and what are you going to do to change it. So identify the problem and then put a plan around how you're going to adjust it. And just look at how many people have requested workplace adjustments and how quickly those have been afforded them. Because one of the things you don't want is an employee to come into the organization. As an example, maybe I am vision impaired and I need a screen reader. The worst thing to do is to say it's going to take you 6 weeks. I can't work without that if I don't have it. So make sure that the translation from the request to the implementation is quick. And so you can actually measure that because you can see the date they requested and the date they received it. So measure those things to see how effective you are. And then just conduct regular reviews on how to do that. And the other thing is, which I mentioned earlier, which is one of I think, where we're going to get change happening, is with the financial services sector, is if they report transparently. So put it on their webpage and say, this is our journey, this is where we're at, and this is our destination. This is where we want to be by 2027, say. We currently have 2% of our employees with disability. Currently, we don't have any accessible and inclusive procurement practices. But actually, by 2027, we want to have that embedded, that it's the first thing that happens when, we start to order equipment and services, software, etc.
And on that point of disclosure, I believe that 90% of individuals with disabilities have invisible disabilities. Is that right? So there's still a lot of stigma around this topic, and that can be a big barrier in effectively implementing this. Can you give us some examples of organisations that are leading in best practice across different sectors?
Oh, yes. There are some great organisations. In fact, let me start with the organisation that this year won the index, the Access and Inclusion Index for the year. They were the top performer, and that was Coles. So they have a recruitment practice which is completely accessible and inclusive, right from the moment the job is considered through to the design of the ad, through to the recruitment process, through to the onboarding, and then through to the career progression. So they leave no stone unturned in all of this process. And they have really good systems and processes in place. They also, their customer experience, they've now created this time every week where people with disability can come in. Those who don't like noise can come in and shop across all the Coles supermarkets on a certain day at a certain time. And so that's a great organisation that's heard, listens, talks to people with disability. So they co-design a lot of their stuff with people with disability in mind, or if disability in the conversation. So that's a great organisation. Another organisation that does it extremely well is Westpac Bank. Westpac Bank has a huge amount of autonomy that they give their access and inclusion lead. It's front and center of everything they do. They really support the person who is heading up accessibility and really making sure products and services are inclusive. They've even changed a credit card now so that people who are vision impaired can actually know the way to use the card, and it really is quite incredible. Another organisation that did something really amazing and they continue to do this stuff, is Australia Post. So the way they've included people with disability, they really did a top-down approach, and that's where success really happens, is right at board level. A board member is assigned a responsibility around access and inclusion. That board member comes to the Disability Employee Network meetings, and they participate in some of those meetings. They check in the C-suite at the CEO level. They report. Persons with disability come in and report at those C-suite meetings, and that's when they discover, oh, we're not doing this well. We've got to get better at this. There's so many. Medibank's another example of a great organisation that does really good stuff. ANZ is amazing. They've been doing it for a very long time around really looking at recruiting people with disability, prioritising it, making it happen. So, yes, there's a lot of good organisations out there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Corene. Where can people connect with you and the Australian Network on Disability?
So Australian Disability Network is australiandisabilitynetwork.org.au, and you can contact us online. We have a Facebook page, we've got an Instagram, we've got a web page. We're everywhere, and you can find me on LinkedIn as well if you want to contact me directly. But all those who are listening today, all I can say to you is one tip, and that is never assume anything about anyone. You just mentioned about the hidden disabilities. You cannot see who has a disability or not. And so never assume anything about anyone. Always ask the person. And by asking the person, you are then providing that space for them to say they actually have an adjustment. And the other tip is just know that everybody's disability is as unique as their fingerprint. So the fact that I'm a wheelchair user doesn't mean to say that my needs are the same as any other wheelchair user. Or the fact that I'm blind doesn't mean to say that I need the same equipment as another blind person, which goes back to my same point. Always ask the person.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Corene. I'm Rose Mary Petrass, and that is a wrap for today. Tune in next week to hear the latest on nature-related financial disclosures with Tony Goldner, Executive Director of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures.
The Greenaway podcast is a product of FS Sustainability, a show about people, the planet, and investing in our collective future. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. The Greenaway podcast gives listeners access to information and educational content provided by discussing numerous financial sustainable options and our featured guests. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. The hosts of The Greener Way are not financial professionals and are not aware of your personal financial circumstances. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement and, if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.